All right, so this time you've brought us a whole stack of articles all about the Trump administration's actions in early February 2025.
It's quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's like a mix of things, right? We got news reports, analyses, even some FAQs.
Yeah. Wow.
And they all paint kind of an intense picture of what's been happening.
Lots of action.
Yeah, executive orders, policy shifts.
Yeah.
Strong reactions all over the place.
Yeah, a lot of reaction.
So we're here to help you unpack all that.
Sounds good.
Figure out what's most important and understand where things might be headed from here.
Yeah, I think that's key. With this much activity, it can be hard to really make sense of the big picture.
Exactly.
The trends and the potential consequences, right? What's the long-term impact going to be?
Right. And one thing that jumps out right away is just how much is aimed at the federal government itself.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we're not just talking about, some budget cuts here and there.
Uh-huh.
This seems way more radical than that.
I see.
Like the American Federation of Government Employees, the largest federal employee union.
Oh, the AFGE.
Yeah, they're using some pretty strong language.
Like what?
They're saying these moves are a deliberate attempt to destroy the government, not just streamline it.
Wow, destroy, huh? That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it makes you wonder why they're so alarmed.
Right. What's behind that kind of statement?
Well, one major issue they're pointing to is this policy that changes how tens of thousands of nonpartisan federal employees are classified.
And what does that mean exactly?
Essentially, it makes them a lot easier to fire.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so all these civil service protections that were put in place to prevent, politically motivated firings and just to ensure a stable and experienced workforce, those are basically being stripped away.
So instead of having to prove someone's incompetent or that they did something wrong to fire them,
right,
the administration could just dismiss employees more easily.
Potentially, yeah. And maybe even for reasons that, fit their own political agenda.
I see. So it's about control.
Right. And the AFGE is arguing that this could have huge ripple effects throughout the whole government.
Oh, wow.
Affecting everything from how quickly veterans' claims are processed to the delivery of Social Security benefits.
So basically essential services that people rely on.
Exactly. And they're saying it could mean longer wait times, backlogs, and just a general decline in the quality of those services.
Wow. So it's not just about politics. It's about real-world impacts on people's lives.
Exactly. And it's easy to dismiss this as, typical union talk.
Sure.
But even some Republicans seem to be on board with shrinking the government.
Really?
Yeah. The articles mentioned that House Speaker Mike Johnson,
a Trump ally,
right, he supports dismantling at least one federal agency, the Department of Education.
Oh, wow. The whole department. That's pretty significant.
It is. And it suggests that there's at least some bipartisan support for, reducing the role of the federal government.
Though I'm sure not all Republicans are thrilled with everything that's going on.
Yeah. Definitely not. Senator Rand Paul, for instance, has been quite critical of some of Trump's other actions.
Yeah. We'll get into that later.
Right. So we're seeing this push to dismantle parts of the federal government, and it's causing some serious worry about what it'll mean for everyday Americans who depend on those services.
Makes sense.
What's the administration's reasoning behind all of this?
Right. Are they just saying they want to increase efficiency, or is there a bigger ideological goal here?
That's a great question.
Well, it's interesting because they're definitely using that language, efficiency and streamlining, saying these changes are needed to cut waste and make the government more responsive to the needs of the people.
Right.
But then critics come in and argue that it's all just a cover.
A cover for what?
They say it's really about weakening the government's ability to do things like regulate businesses, protect the environment, and enforce civil rights.
So it's a power play.
Exactly.
To shift the balance away from the federal government and toward, well, who exactly?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some people say it's about empowering states and local communities.
Oh, right.
Others say it's more about giving more power to corporations and the wealthy.
Interesting.
It's also worth thinking about what it could mean for vulnerable populations who rely on government programs and protections.
That's a crucial point. We can't just talk about this in some abstract way.
Right.
We have to consider the real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely.
Now, let's shift gears a bit, because another major area where Trump's been making waves is transgender rights.
Uh-huh.
And there's one executive order in particular that stands out. It's called Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports.
Yeah, I've heard about that one.
Can you give us an overview of what it's all about?
Sure. So basically, it aims to ban transgender women from competing in women's sports at all levels.
All levels.
Yep, from high school to professional leagues.
Wow.
And the administration's argument is that it's about fairness for cisgender women athletes.
Okay.
They claim that transgender women have a biological advantage.
And is there any research to support that?
Well, one of the articles you gave me actually cites a research review from 2017.
Okay.
And it found no consistent evidence of a significant biological advantage for transgender women in sports.
Interesting.
It also points out that a lot of athletic organizations, like the International Olympic Committee,
Right.
they already have policies that allow transgender athletes to compete in line with their gender identity.
So it seems like this executive order is based more on ideology about gender than on science.
It does appear that way.
And it sounds like it goes way beyond sports, right?
Yeah, it's part of a much bigger push to restrict the rights of transgender people in general. The articles talk about how the order also calls for a review of visa policies for transgender women entering the U.S.,
Oh, wow.
which could open the door for all sorts of fraud investigations.
I see.
And Secretary of State Marco Rubio is supposedly being tasked with promoting this whole stance internationally.
Even at the UN.
Yep, that's what it says.
So they're really trying to embed this policy in this larger framework, connecting it to things like immigration, international relations,
Exactly.
and this whole cultural battle over gender identity.
It's a big issue.
It is. And how are the courts reacting to all of this?
Well, there's been quite a bit of pushback already.
Really?
Yeah, a federal judge recently blocked a separate Trump order that would force transgender women in federal prisons to be housed with men.
Wow.
The judge cited the potential for irreparable harm and pointed out that there's no evidence that these women pose a threat to others.
So on one hand, you have the administration pushing this narrative about fairness and safety.
Uh-huh.
And on the other hand, you have a judge recognizing the very real dangers and discrimination that transgender women face.
It's a complex situation.
It is, and it seems like this whole issue is headed for a long and complicated legal battle.
No doubt about it, and it really highlights how divided society is when it comes to transgender rights.
Yes.
This isn't just about policy.
Yeah.
It's about fundamental questions of identity, equality, and human dignity.
It's a battle that's likely to play out in courtrooms, legislatures, and public opinion for years to come.
Absolutely. It's something we'll need to keep a close eye on.
Now, before we move on to foreign policy, which also looks pretty intense based on these articles,
Oh, yeah.
is there anything else about these domestic policy moves that jumps out at you?
I think what's really striking is how interconnected they all are.
In what way?
Well, we're seeing this pattern of the administration using executive power pretty aggressively, targeting marginalized groups and promoting a vision of American society that a lot of people find exclusionary and even dangerous.
It's definitely a trend worth paying attention to.
Absolutely, as we try to make sense of what's happening and where it might lead us.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about already, and we haven't even touched on foreign policy yet.
Oh, we've got a whole lot more to unpack.
I'm almost afraid to ask, but what's waiting for us there?
We'll just hold on to your hats because things are about to get even more interesting.
Okay, buckle up, everybody.
You know, we should probably talk a bit more about that transgender sports ban.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Because it's already causing quite a stir at, like, the high school and college level.
Really?
Yeah. You know how the articles mentioned several states are basically going along with Trump's order, passing similar laws of their own?
Right, right.
So it's creating this whole patchwork of policies across the country.
Oh, wow.
You've got some schools trying to follow the ban, while others are just refusing point blank, saying they'll fight it in court.
So it's a mess.
Pretty much. And in the middle of all this, you have the transgender athletes themselves.
Right.
You can't even imagine what it must be like for them.
Yeah, to suddenly have your right to compete questioned like that.
Exactly. One of the sources actually talks about the potential psychological impact on these athletes.
Like what?
Things like increased bullying,
Oh, gosh.
social isolation, and mental health struggles.
That's awful.
It's really sad. And it just shows how these decisions made in Washington, D.C. can have such a huge impact on people's lives.
Especially young people.
Right. They're already dealing with so much.
Exactly. And we have to remember, this isn't happening in isolation.
Oh, definitely not.
This sports ban is part of a much bigger debate about LGBTQ plus rights.
Especially when it comes to transgender youth.
Yeah, we're seeing similar battles over access to healthcare, bathroom use, even what's being taught in schools.
It's a whole cultural shift.
It feels like this sports ban could set a dangerous precedent, you know? Opening the door for even more restrictions on transgender rights down the line.
And while the legal battles play out, it's the individuals who are left to deal with the consequences right now.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the potential consequences of dismantling the federal government that we talked about earlier.
Right. The AFGE isn't just making this stuff up.
No.
They're pointing to concrete ways these policy changes could actually harm everyday Americans.
Right, things like longer wait times for veterans trying to get benefits, delays in processing Social Security claims,
Right.
maybe even disruptions in things like food safety inspections or air traffic control.
It's scary to think about.
It's almost like a slow-motion government shutdown.
Yeah.
But instead of closing the doors completely, they're just making it harder and harder for these agencies to function.
And you have to wonder, is that intentional?
Right, like, is the goal to create so much chaos and inefficiency that people just give up on the government altogether?
It's not a new idea.
No, we heard a lot about the deep state during Trump's first term.
Right, that whole idea of a shadowy network working against the will of the people.
Exactly, and this push to dismantle the federal government could be seen as a continuation of that.
So instead of trying to fix the government or make it better, the goal is to just weaken it until it's useless.
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
It is, and the implications are huge.
Yeah, like if people lose trust in these democratic institutions, then what?
Exactly. It creates this breeding ground for cynicism, apathy, maybe even extremism.
And all of this is happening at a time when the U.S. is facing so many other challenges.
Right, domestically and internationally.
We've got the climate crisis, the rise of authoritarianism around the world, increasing polarization within our own society.
It seems like we need a strong and capable government now more than ever.
I agree, and these actions could have consequences that last far beyond just, bureaucratic inefficiencies.
Like, what happens if all these experienced civil servants are driven out of government because of these changes?
Right. Who takes their place?
Will it be people who are actually qualified and dedicated to public service?
Or will it be political appointees with questionable backgrounds and maybe hidden agendas?
It's easy to imagine a scenario where the quality of government services just plummets.
Yeah, and the scary thing is we don't really know what the long-term effects will be.
But they could be really damaging.
This isn't just about changing policies.
It's about undermining the very foundations of our democracy.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder if there's any way to fix this damage once it's done.
Rebuilding trust in government and attracting good people back into public service takes time.
It's not an easy process.
No, it's not. And it requires real commitment to things like transparency, accountability, and a genuine desire to serve the public.
I think it's important to acknowledge that not everyone sees these actions as negative.
Oh, definitely.
Some people genuinely believe that smaller government is better, that transgender women competing in women's sports is unfair.
Right.
And that Trump is just trying to shake things up and get things done.
There are different perspectives out there, and we need to be able to engage with those perspectives even if we don't agree with them.
So how do we do that? How do we bridge this divide between people who see these actions as necessary reforms and those who see them as attacks on fundamental rights and democratic principles?
It feels like we're not even speaking the same language sometimes.
I think it starts with recognizing that there are often legitimate fears and concerns on both sides.
Like, for example, some people might be worried about the erosion of traditional gender roles.
Or the potential for abuse within transgender policies.
And even if those fears are based on misinformation or a lack of understanding, they're still very real to the people who hold them.
So instead of dismissing those concerns, we need to address them directly.
With facts, empathy, and a willingness to listen.
And maybe most importantly, we need to make sure that the voices of those who are most affected by these policies are heard.
Right. So in the case of the transgender sports ban, that means listening to transgender athletes and their families.
Understanding their experiences.
And making sure their perspectives are part of the conversation.
It's about humanizing these issues.
Yeah. Moving
beyond the abstract arguments and the political rhetoric and recognizing the real people whose lives are being impacted.
Well said. And, while we've covered a lot of ground here, there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't really explored yet.
Oh, right. Foreign policy.
Yeah, we touched on it briefly, but it's worth digging a little deeper.
Especially that whole Gaza Strip proposal.
Oh, yeah. That one has even some Republicans scratching their heads.
What's the general reaction been like to that?
It's been a mix of confusion and concern, even among Trump's usual supporters.
Really?
Yeah, this proposal is a huge departure from decades of U.S. policy in the region. It could really entangle the U.S. in an already complicated and volatile conflict.
And it's not just the policy itself that's raising eyebrows, right?
No, it's how Trump's talking about it.
What do you mean?
He's using language like making Gaza the Riviera of the Middle East
Oh, wow.
and talking about sending in U.S. troops to secure the territory.
It's like he's approaching this incredibly sensitive issue as a real estate deal.
Exactly, not as a deeply rooted geopolitical conflict.
It's a worrying oversimplification.
And it makes you wonder if he really understands how complex the situation is.
It seems like another example of him acting unilaterally.
Right, making decisions without consulting experts or thinking about the potential consequences.
Like, he's ignoring the advice of seasoned diplomats and foreign policy experts who actually understand the region
Exactly.
and the potential problems with such a drastic change in policy.
It's a recipe for disaster.
And it's not just the Middle East where we're seeing these questionable foreign policy decisions.
Right. We still need to talk about that whole security detail situation.
Yeah, withdrawing protection from those former officials despite the threats from Iran.
It's a strange move.
Especially considering that Trump himself still has protection because of those same threats.
It makes you think that maybe personal grudges are influencing national security decisions.
Which would be a very dangerous precedent.
Absolutely. It raises serious concerns about whether these decisions are being made for the right reasons.
Right. Are they in the best interest of the country, or are they just to settle personal scores?
That's the question.
And what about the bigger picture for U.S. foreign relations?
Right. What does it mean for our alliances and our standing in the world if we're seen as unpredictable and unreliable?
The sources seem to suggest that it could isolate the U.S., embolden our adversaries,
Right.
and make it much harder to achieve our foreign policy goals.
So we've got a lot to think about.
Yeah, so to sum up what we've learned from these sources,
Okay.
Trump is shaking things up domestically, targeting transgender rights, and making some potentially destabilizing moves on the international stage.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, and it leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions about what it all means for the future.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface here.
Right.
The legal battles, the political maneuvering, and the cultural debates around these issues will probably go on for years.
It's a stark reminder that we're living in a time of huge change and uncertainty, both at home and abroad.
Definitely.
It's so important for all of us to stay informed, engage in thoughtful dialogue,
Right.
and hold our leaders accountable.
Well said. And maybe the most important takeaway from this deep dive isn't just the information itself, but the questions it raises.
The questions.
Yeah, I encourage everyone to keep exploring these issues, challenge their own assumptions, and seek out different perspectives.
That's great advice.
It's all about continuing to learn and grow.
Well, thank you for helping us navigate this whirlwind of information.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and we hope it sparked some curiosity and encouraged everyone to keep digging deeper.
Remember, staying informed is an ongoing process.
The quest for knowledge never really ends.
That's right. So until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.
Okay, so let's get into these foreign policy moves, because things are getting a little wild from what I'm reading here.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
We've already mentioned that whole U.S. taking charge of the Gaza Strip idea.
Right. That one's causing quite a stir.
Even some Republicans are calling it problematic. What's the overall reaction been like?
It's been a mix of confusion and concern, to be honest.
Even from Trump's usual supporters.
Yeah, even they're hesitant on this one. It's a pretty big shift from how the U.S. has dealt with the region for decades.
Right. And it has the potential to drag the U.S. into an already messy and volatile conflict.
Exactly. And it's not just the policy itself that's raising eyebrows.
What else then?
It's the way Trump's talking about it. He's
Right.
using this language like making Gaza the Riviera of the Middle East.
Really?
Yeah, and he's throwing around ideas about sending in U.S. troops to secure the territory.
It sounds like he's treating this delicate situation like some kind of real estate deal.
Exactly, not like a deeply rooted geopolitical conflict with a long history.
That's a pretty dangerous oversimplification.
It is, and it makes you wonder if he really understands the complexities of what's going on over there.
It feels like we're back to that tendency of his to just act without thinking.
Yeah, making decisions without consulting the experts or really considering the consequences.
Like he's just brushing aside all the advice from experienced diplomats and foreign policy experts.
The people who actually understand the region and the potential problems with changing things so drastically.
And it's not just the Middle East where we're seeing these questionable foreign policy moves either.
Right. What about that whole security detail thing?
Yeah, withdrawing protection from those former officials, even though there are still threats from Iran.
That one's a head-scratcher.
Especially since Trump himself still has protection because of those same threats.
It makes you think maybe it's more about personal grudges than national security.
Which would be a very bad sign.
It sets a dangerous precedent.
Because then it raises serious concerns about whether these decisions are being made in the best interest of the country.
Or if they're just about settling scores.
What does that mean for U.S. foreign relations in general?
If other countries see us as unreliable and unpredictable, what happens to our alliances?
And our standing in the world.
It definitely weakens our position.
So to recap what we've learned from all these articles.
Okay, let's see.
Trump's shaking things up at home, targeting transgender rights, and making some pretty risky moves on the international stage.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest.
It is, and it leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions about where we go from here.
We've really only scratched the surface.
Right.
All these legal battles, the political maneuvering, and the cultural debates around these issues will probably continue to play out for years.
It's a reminder that we're living in a time of constant change and uncertainty.
Both at home and abroad.
And it's crucial for all of us to stay informed, to keep the conversation going, and hold our leaders accountable.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for guiding us through all of this.
It's been quite the deep dive.
It has, and we hope it's left you with some new insights and a desire to learn even more.
Remember, staying informed is a journey, not a destination.
So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep those conversations going.
Until next time.